Everybody, and welcome at Hartford Seminary. I recognize a few faces and I'm pleased to see you again, and for those I have never seen, I hope this will not be the last time we will see you around. And it's a great pleasure for me to introduce the speakers tonight and to tell you a little bit about this special issue concerning Islam and the 500 years anniversary of the Protestant Reformation. I'm Yahya Michot, co-editor of the Muslim World Journal for the last few years. My colleague Timur Yuskayev, who is the other co-editor, could not be present tonight, so please excuse his absence. And of course, our managing editor, Nick Mumajian, is around, and this is an opportunity for me to thank him on behalf of the MacDonald Center, which is editing officially the Muslim World Journal. We couldn't do anything without you, Nick, and we are very, very thankful indeed that you are our managing editor. So the Muslim World Journal was founded in 1911. We publish 4 issues a year. Some of those issues are special issues. And we have tried during the last few years to have special issues relating to the relations between Islam and other religions. That's why we published first special issue on Hindu and Muslim relations. We also published a special issue on Judaism and Islam in America. We also published a special issue on Islam and Buddhism. And with the special issue we are celebrating today, we are coming back to Christianity, as it will be Islam somehow and the Protestant Reformation. We have projects for the future. We have in the pipeline, hopefully, an issue that will celebrate the 800th anniversary of the meeting between St. Francis of Assisi and the Sultan al-Kamel in Egypt in 1219. So next year would be the 800th anniversary. And we also think now about having a special issue about Islam and Orthodox Christianity. That would probably be for 2020 or 2021. I think you realize that publishing 4 issues a year on time is not a sinecure, and we are very fortunate that we are indeed able to follow that rhythm, and that the journal is indeed read widely, not only among academics or in universities, but even sometimes by diplomats and the Foreign Affairs Ministry. I don't know how you say that in this country, but it's the Foreign Affairs Ministry. And so tonight we have had this idea that just as we had done for the special issue about Hinduism and Islam, it would be nice to have a celebration for the Protestant Reformation and Islam issue. And this special issue would not have been published if it hadn't been for the talent, the skill of my colleague David Grafton, who was the special guest editor, who indeed was able to attract the contributions of a number of scholars, among whom we have the other speaker for tonight, with Dr. Ryad, who is coming from my country, Belgium. So you are most welcome tonight. And I will not speak much longer, just thanking both of you, David for being the guest editor of this issue, and you for crossing the Atlantic and coming to America to speak to us about what you and your colleagues have wanted to achieve by publishing this special issue. So before even we let them speak, I think that you can all show your appreciation for what they have accomplished.
Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome. We're delighted that you're here for this presentation, and a special word of welcome. I'm glad to see Dr. Ayub here in the front row. You're most welcome. It's a delight to see you. So what I'm going to do is say a few words about this particular edition and how it came about and how it was constructed, and then to offer some words by way of general terms, the article that I wrote for the journal, and then I'll turn it over to my colleague. I'll introduce and turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Ryad. And then after that, we'll take questions and answers following both presentations, if that's okay. Right? So October 31st, 2017 marked the 500th year since Martin Luther, an Augustinian monk from Wittenberg, a backwater town in Germany, reportedly nailed his 95 theses, or challenges about medieval church practices, on the door of the castle church in Wittenberg. Now, I say reportedly because nowhere does Martin Luther himself talk about his actually nailing these theses onto the church door, but only his mailing them to his bishop. It is more than likely that the local printer in Wittenberg printed up the 95 theses and posted them on the church door for all to see. And this is something that my colleague Tim Wingert has written about in his book on Martin Luther and the 95 Theses. Nevertheless, this event marked what has been called the Protestant Reformation. And it propelled not only Luther and the medieval Catholic Church into a contentious period of Christian reform and renewal, but it dramatically transformed European culture, society, politics, and ultimately, it transformed world Christianity. Given that the Reformation began during the 16th century, at a time when Europe was dramatically changing, I thought it would be good to offer different perspectives on the Reformation and the anniversary of the Reformation. We often forget that the Reformation occurred during the age of exploration, with the discovery of foreign lands, including North America, that provided the opportunity for the exploitation of raw goods and indigenous peoples. In fact, Luther himself was a young boy when Christopher Columbus waded onto the shores of Hispaniola. The Reformation also occurred during the development of technological and cultural advances, the printing press being one, the rise of the universities, and the Renaissance. Thus, it seemed to me important to put the Reformation into a larger and broader perspective, and specifically, in my area of interest, Christian-Muslim relations. So let's talk about this particular issue of Christian-Muslim relations. According to Kenneth Appold, in his history on the Reformation, titled The Reformation, the Christianization of Europe in the Middle Ages was a complex affair that included the institutionalization of the church, regulation and enforcement of Latin Catholic beliefs, as well as spiritual and economic reform movements against this institutionalization. Some of these movements included the monastics, like the Benedictines, sectarian movements, such as the Waldensians and the Cathars, spiritualists, such as even St. Francis, reformers like John Huss, and even the Council of Trent. What distinguished Martin Luther from these other reform movements was that his actions in Germany were ultimately effective in creating a social and political movement supported by the princes and potentates. German princes, and then later Swiss, Dutch, as we'll hear in the next presentation, Danish, Swedish, Norwegian, and of course English rulers all threw their hat into the ring to create new Christian institutions. What aided Luther and his fellow reformers was an effective use of a startling new tool in world history, the printing press, the movable type printing press. Much like those tech-savvy millennials who exploited Facebook to organize the 2011 Arab Spring, Luther and his colleagues exploited this new technology, producing pamphlets to share their ideas with the princes, clergy, and general population of the day. Now, Luther was a prolific writer, the most popular author of his time, thanks to this printing press. He published thousands of pages of material in both Latin, the language of the educated, as well as in German, the language of the common people. He wrote not only reams of theological or exegetical material, but ethical guides, his large and small catechism, church services, and hymns for popular singing. Of course, he would become most famous for his translation of the Christian scriptures from the sacred Latin Vulgate into Middle German for the common people. This translation would ultimately create a unified German language and identity. Luther was, as Roland Bainton says, the German Hercules. However, another important aspect of the success of the Protestant Reformation was the impact of the Ottoman Empire on Lutheran and later other Protestant communities. The Reformation scholar George Forel once opined, "It was the constant danger of a Turkish invasion that had kept the Holy Roman Emperor from taking severe measures against Luther's Reformation. The empire needed the help of the evangelical princes in the war against the Turks, and therefore had to postpone his plans to destroy Luther. From the point of view of realistic power politics, the safety of the Reformation depended on the strength of Turkish armies." The most popular work to explore this Ottoman-German relationship was that of Stephen Fisher Galati, whose 1959 classic Ottoman Imperialism and German Protestantism is still a standard reference work even today, as is noted by several authors in this edition. However, much research and writing has taken place since 1959, and so it seemed appropriate at this time, and since there was so much hoopla among Protestants and Lutherans in particular about this event, that we should explore Ottoman Protestant relationships. And this has been demonstrated in this edition of the Muslim World. While there have been many publications and presentations and conferences these past 2 years in leading up to the commemoration of the 500th anniversary, most focused on Protestant Catholic relationships. And and ask the question, what does the Reformation mean today? How do we move forward? In this issue, however, I was interested in looking back at events and reframing them a bit differently. Certainly, the struggles between the Holy Roman Empire and the Ottoman Empire have been looked at and explored, as I've intimated here. However, in many ways, the relationship between Protestants, or between Europe and the Ottoman Empire, has commonly been viewed as a clash of civilizations. Or as one recent author has put it, a clash for the soul of Europe. Martin Luther's perspective on the Turk has contributed to this clash theory, primarily because of his apocalyptic tendencies to see the Turks as, quote, the Antichrist in temporal form. Yet it seems to me that much of the previous Reformation scholarship on the Turks or on the Ottoman Empire has had a Eurocentric perspective, or even more importantly, a Protestant-centric perspective. Rarely have European Christian and Ottoman Muslim relations of this period been viewed from the broader perspective of what I call the age of exploration, imperial politics, and religious reform in a broad sense. By this I mean, first, the Reformation takes place in a time in which empires are expanding through their discoveries of new trade routes, expanding markets, and composite mercantile activities that both precede and follow these empires. It also includes the wanderlust of explorers and travelers who live on and in between the borders of these empires, and the new ideas to which they were exposed. Thus, this collection of articles in this edition has been solicited by Muslim and Christian scholars who've been looking afresh at Muslim and Christian encounters during this period of renewal and reform, Tajdid wa Islah. I want to highlight a few of the arguments from several of these articles, as I think they shed new light on how I think this period, at least for me as a traditional Lutheran, might be reframed. The articles by Ahmed Akudnuz and Ertugrul Kuchukuya, John Balasarek, Christine Isom Verharen, and Omar Ryad recover for us the interactions in between the empires. They relate for us the stories of merchants, wanderers, diplomats, scholars, and dare we say, friends that developed between cultures and religions. Moreover, they leave open, at least for me, the question of what if? What do we actually know about these past relationships? Would a reading of these direct encounters, or a careful reading of these direct encounters, make more of an impact on our views of the imperial politics or the clashes that become evident in some of the articles, especially those by Adam Francisco and Stefan Hans, where imperial and religious loyalty and honor is considered first and foremost in the face of an enemy, be they Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, Sunni, or Sufi. Luther was certainly not the first nor last Catholic reformer. In fact, renewal and reform take place within the Ottoman Empire among Christians and Muslims, each arguing that they were not producing innovations, but rather that they were rereading their traditions in a more faithful manner, in an original manner, by going back to the sources of faith, what Luther calls ad fontes. This broader perspective of renewal and reform is explored wonderfully in an article by Eugenia Kermali, who examines the leadership and thinking of the ecumenical patriarch of Constantinople, Kyrillos Lucaris. It was Lucaris who provides a very different view of the concept of a clash of empires. For Patriarch Lucaris was notably, first and foremost, an Ottoman subject, who was interested and enamored with Protestant views and thinking, and imagined such possibilities among his own people in his own Ottoman context. Kermeli argues that Lucaris worked within the common discourse of renewal, innovation, and tradition of the Greek Orthodox Church in response to and among the Sunni reform movement, the Kadizadeli movement within the Ottoman Empire. And finally, in this edition, we as readers are asked and pushed to, in the concluding article by Joshua Ralston, who asked the question, might we look at some of the important, quote, overlapping theological themes which Protestants of the Reformed tradition and Sunni Muslims may share? In the end, these articles offer an incredible opportunity for further reflection and research on Christian-Muslim relations in an era of reform. Now, on to Luther. It was within this broader framework that I've described that I was interested in looking at Martin Luther and his view of the Turks and their religion. So let me say a few words about Martin Luther's sources. First of all, I want to say that my article here does not uncover any new material about Luther's writings on the Turks and Islam, and very much follows along with others who have looked at Luther and the Turks. However, I'm suggesting two things that I do not believe have been given adequate attention. First, it is important to remember that unlike his experience with the Jewish community in Germany, Luther never met a Turk, a Moor, a Muslim. I think this is important food for thought. Second, it is important to gauge his view of Islam not just based on his 6 writings, but on the sources that he had and when he had them. Given this, I found that there are 3 distinct phases in Luther's life in which he had access to different kinds of material or sources on Islam. First, Luther's primary source of Islam during most of his life was not a specific text, but general information, filtered through the socio-political context of Central Europe during an era that feared Ottoman imperialism. This fear became ubiquitous in German society throughout the exposure of the German populace to woodcuts and pamphlets that described the horrors of Ottoman barbarism. It was the fear of the Turk. It was this fear in general view that was palpable for Luther. And so he responds in his writings and in his sermons and in his exegesis to his congregation in Wittenberg and other Protestant communities. I just finished teaching a course this fall on Luther, the Jews, and the Turks. And as my students well know, as they were required to do all the reading, Luther not only had theological acumen and ability to produce thousands of pages of written material, Luther had a barbed tongue. He had a penchant for hyperbole and acerbic statements. What I told my students I call potty mouth. His wicked linguistic lashings were aimed at just about everyone imaginable. The Pope, first and foremost, the monks, the German princes and peasants, the Turks, the Jews, and himself. In many cases, his words would now be considered inappropriate and are offensive. While Luther's later writing on the Jews of Germany gave the Nazis all the theological ammunition they needed for their atrocities, Luther's negative comments on the Turks were common pejorative epithets that he used throughout his life. For an example, in his appeal for prayer against the Turks, written during the threat of an Ottoman incursion up the Danube in 1541, Luther writes, "The two kingdoms, that of the Turk and that of the Pope, are the two last plagues of the wrath of God, as the Apocalypse calls them. They are the false prophet and the beast, and both must be bound and cast into the lake of fire." To understand these comments about the Turks and their religion, one needs to understand Luther's theological perspectives. First, based on his reading of the Bible in the early church, Luther believed that God worked in two primary realms, an earthly realm and a spiritual realm. The earthly, often called the two kingdoms doctrine or a two kingdoms perspective. In the first kingdom, since God is sovereign of countries, God creates systems and structures for the purpose of ongoing life, for human beings to be ruled and in community. The second way in which God works is in the spiritual realm, the publicly proclaimed message that calls people to repentance and new life through faith in Jesus the Christ. This is the role of the church. This two kingdoms perspective, in many ways, God reminds us that we need God in both realms. And in a similar way, God works in two ways in both kingdoms. First, God reminds us that we need to repent of sin. And therefore, we are accountable to God's judgment. This Luther calls the law. However, God primarily reminds us that even when we go wrong, that God acts to correct, to restore, to repair. This is the gospel. For Luther, the word gospel is primarily a theological concept. God is always acting in this twofold manner, both law and gospel. In this way, Luther understood the Turks as emissaries of God in the earthly realm as a punishment on European Christendom as law, by threatening the earthly livelihood of Germans. However, he also understood the Turks as God's means of driving Christians back into faith in Christ, to repentance. Gospel. Thus, the Turks fulfill this twofold role: God's judgment and an opportunity for restoration. In his defense and explanation of the 95 Theses, in 1520, Luther wrote, "To fight against the Turks is nothing but to strive against God, who is punishing our sins by means of the Turks." When Luther wrote this, many, including the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor, saw this as treason. Perhaps pacifism, encouraging Germans not to fight against the advancing armies of Suleiman the Magnificent. To add to this theological perspective of the two kingdoms, we also need to understand that Luther was also less than a closet apocalypticist. Less than a closet apocalypticist. As Heiko Obermann noted in his classic work, Luther, Man Between God and the Devil, Luther was a medievalist for whom demonic forces and the devil were very real. He experienced the world in the throes and tribulations of the end times. Here we have a woodcut that was developed for Luther's 1535 translation of the Bible. And it is a picture next to Revelation 20, the gathering of the armies of Gog and Magog in Revelation 20. The image that was printed and put in the Bible depicts the siege of Vienna by the Turks in 1529, and thus the readers are given a clear message about the end times. Thus, the Turks were both part of God's plan as well as working out the devil's work. In addition to the image that we find in the Bible, there were numerous other artistic portraits and woodcuts of the horrors of the Turkish armies, of Turks coming up the Danube and sacking German-Hungarian villages. The Turks were the bogeymen, described through pamphlets being passed around Germany and the woodcuts that were printed. Now, this was Luther's primary information on the Turks. In 1528, before the siege of Vienna, he read several works on Islam, including one that was Tractus de Moribus Conditionibus Ethnica Turcorum, or the life of George of Hungary and his view on the condition and the culture of the Turks. Now, George was held in captivity, and here is a picture of one of the pages from this book. George was held in captivity for 20 years before he escaped to Italy and wrote about his experiences. It was the information about Islam in George of Hungary's work, his diary, that appears in Luther's writings. However, this material appears throughout Luther's writings, his Bible commentaries, letters, recorded narrations of his students called table talks. And it is this reason that I argue that to understand the broader picture of Christian-Muslim relations in Europe at the time, we need to move beyond Luther's direct writings on Islam and pay a close attention to what was going on in a wide body of literature that he wrote and read in between the lines. Lastly, Luther comes across in 1543, only 2.5 years before his death, a copy of a Latin translation of the Quran. It is more than likely that this was Robert of Keaton's Latin translation done in the 1140s, some 400 years before Luther. This translation did not endear him to the teachings of Islam. In fact, as I often say, it sent him off the deep end. He was critical of Muhammad, for as he believed Muhammad was making up the Quran, as was common among other Latin Christian writers at the time. Luther then dusts off a previous polemical work that he read by the Dominican friar Ricaldo de Montecroce and makes a free German translation for his German readers about what the Quran meant. Now, if, as most of us Lutherans have done, in reading Luther only from his perspective or his writings, or that of the German people, the German princes, or that of the Holy Roman Emperor, we certainly will have a particular view of the Turk, and that is nothing less than the Antichrist. However, put into a larger context of both official Ottoman government practices and policies, or the stories of Muslim merchants, diplomats, and scholars that we find in this edition of the Muslim world, we might find, and we will find, a more complicated and nuanced perspective. By by only reading Luther's particular writings on the Turks, such as his On War Against the Turk or Appeal for Prayer Against the Turks. It's kind of like reading the history of the United States only from the perspective of military history. Say that of the biography of Tecumseh Sherman or George Patton, and not from a broader economic, social, or religious historical perspective. However, Luther does provide for us the reality of the context of German fear, to which he does respond. Therefore, in conclusion, the motivating factor for my article in exploring what Luther knew about Islam and when is ultimately to help me reflect on Muslim and Christian relationships today. By putting Luther into a broader framework, as presented in this collection of articles, we might think afresh about potential lessons to be learned about moments of fear. Today, we live in the midst of interfaith relationships of real people and not across borders of empires. But will we continue to further those images of the bogeyman that we find in these German woodcuts, or tropes of an apocalyptic enemy, both past and present or even future? Or might we imagine and find real relationships that took place and take place between the perceived clash of empires? Enough of Luther. Thank you. Now, I'm delighted, I'm actually very delighted simply because the logistical arrangements that you had to make to get here. I'm delighted to be able to turn over the podium to a colleague that I've been working with on an international project for a number of years, the Christian-Muslim Relations Bibliographic History, Dr. Ryad from the University of Leuven.
Belgium,
in Belgium.
Yeah, the Dutch-speaking one.
Leuven, thank you. Dr. Ryad is a professor of Arabic and Islamic Studies, Faculty of Arts at the University of Leuven in Belgium. In addition to numerous articles, his most recent book publication includes Islamic Reformism and Christianity, a critical reading of the works of Muhammad Rashid Ridda and his associates, Transnational Islam in Interwar Europe, Muslim Activists and Thinkers. And he is also has the upcoming publication with Susanna Heschel on the Muslim reception of European Orientalism, Reversing the Gaze, that's you're working on right now and will be coming out with from Routledge. And I also found out last night that he has just received, as of yesterday or the day before, just received the nomination in Belgium for the Royal Young Academics Academy. So you've been nominated for that. So we're delighted to hear that. That's great. So let us welcome Dr. Ryad.
Thank you so much, David and Yahya and everybody for this invitation. I'm really delighted to be here as well. Actually, what I'm going to do is just like informal talk about the article I have written to this special issue regarding the Dutch. And when I'm talking about the Dutch here, it means in the wider sense, the Dutch and the Belgian, at least the Flemish-speaking part of the Netherlands. As you see in the title, it's just like rather Turkish than Papist, which is actually in Dutch was Liever Turks dan Paps. And this is actually a very interesting statement that shows the argument I'm going to present today, because this is how the Dutch received the ugly Turk. I mean, just we have heard about that, how Luther presented and portrayed the Turks, the Muslims, in this Protestant imagination. But here, the Dutch received it differently, and how the Dutch received it and also perceived Islam, this is what I'm going to show with you. And it's typically a Catholic Protestant problem, because we know, and this is just like as a background for my argument today, why on the one hand, you find in the Dutch perception of Islam, on the one hand, it's still the ugly religion, the cruel Turk, on the one hand, with these remnant medieval and even early Protestant or Lutheran ideas about Islam in that negative sense, while on the other hand, the Dutch Republic, after its establishment in the late 16th century, appreciated their relationship with Islam, even consolidated their political appropriation and ties with the Ottoman Empire. And this has happened in that scene. You see on the here on that part, you see Philip II, the Catholic Spanish king, and on the other hand, the Prince of Orange, William of Orange, or as known, William the Silent. We know that William was just like, he was the owner of the big estates in the Dutch region, from Antwerp to Amsterdam, and he was under the Catholic reign. He was just like, nominated by the Catholic king to run this part of the Catholic empire of that time. But at a certain moment during his reign to the, in the Dutch provinces, he was not happy about the Catholic pressure on the spread of Protestantism in the region, and therefore he rebelled against the Catholic king, and he established the Dutch Republic, which was at this time the Dutch Republic of 7 provinces, including this Flemish part of Belgium we know nowadays, from Antwerp to Amsterdam. So these 7 provinces were under the control of William Orange, and he rebelled against the Catholic king, and it was a very heavy war which durated for 80 years, which is known in the Dutch history as the 80 Years' War. Within that, we have just heard David talking about Luther and his ideas about Islam. You see that there emerged also in the Dutch Reformation several ideas about Islam and how we could use Islam and Muslims also as a political tool against the Catholic king. And here emerged the idea, the enemy of my enemy is a friend. And therefore, you find that the Dutch Prince William of Orange started in the late 16th century to send envoys to the Sultan in Istanbul in order to build up these ties with the Dutch Republic. We know that he sent some traders and diplomats, especially from these elite people who really approached the Ottoman court, and the repercussion in the court, which is very interesting, that the Sultan himself appreciated the Lutherans, and he offered his support for them in a certain way, to the degree that their ties with the Ottoman Empire were used in the war. And what you see there, these Ottoman allies, they saw, as we have seen, the Turk as a cruel, but Muslims were tolerant with their people with other religions. At least they did not burn their rivals' empires. In Antwerp, you see in some religious ceremonies that people getting out of the church and having this song in Dutch, halve manen op de mouw, liever Turks dan Papau. The translation is there, and you can imagine that in Antwerp, people were just like shouting and screaming all these songs on the street, because the Turks, are our friends or become our friends. Therefore, they used even these symbols. What you see there, this is just like what you call the beggars. This was just a group of Dutch soldiers in that time, and they were just protectors of the cities, and they would carry these medals, which are still, to see in some museums. And what you see there is exactly Liever Turks dan Paps, written in Dutch, and they were these beggars, these sea beggars, would carry these pinning, as it is in Dutch, the medals as a symbol of that. What is interesting, what we know from that history, that even Dutch ships in the Mediterranean were using Ottoman flags beside, other flags, but Ottoman flags and also symbols. And sometimes in some municipalities, we know that in that period, during the time of William of Orange, that the Dutch would have also Ottoman flags on the buildings of municipalities. So you see that now that the Turks were just like received in that positive sense in the Dutch society, not only in the political arenas, but also in the public sphere, that there was a space, at least a room of appreciation to the Turks. Even in Dutch paintings, what you see there, you see people in Amsterdam in Oriental clothes, because Amsterdam was a hub for trade between the Mediterranean and the Ottoman Empire and also North Africa. But what is interesting about these pictures, we should not always imagine them as Muslims, because they are Oriental, in Oriental attire, which could be also Armenian traders or even Orthodox Christians coming from the East. But what is here to see is just an indication how Amsterdam became an international hub, receiving people from different ethnicities, and even some have remained in the Netherlands at this time. With the late 16th century and early 17th century, we find that the political ties have become formalized in a sense. We know that Morocco, the Sultan of Morocco, was among the first, world leaders who recognized the official status of the Dutch Republic. And therefore, in the early 17th century, there were many Moroccan envoys coming to Amsterdam. I will mention some names later. But in 1610, exactly, we find an official recognition by the Moroccan Sultan in that. The Ottoman capitulations were given to the Dutch in 1612, which means that we had the first Dutch envoy, Dutch consul, Cornelis Haga. He was the first consul to arrive in Istanbul in 1612. This is a painting of his, and this is a togra which the Sultan has signed for the Dutch. But what is interesting about that, the major dossiers or just political issues that the Dutch consul was discussing with the Ottoman Empire was slavery and piracy, which were very thorny issues in the relationship between the Ottoman Empire and the Dutch shipping trade of that time. So the idea of liberation of Dutch slaves in the Mediterranean was there, and in order to prove his courtesy to the Sultan, you find that the Dutch sent with him, and this is very, very interesting, sent with him a ship which is known the Zwarte Beer, or the Black Bear, and just giving gifts to the Ottoman Sultan, including Dutch cheese. And this is very remarkable when you study the commodities on that ship, that just including Dutch gifts and commodities giving to the Sultan. The Dutch consul also was advised when he arrived in Istanbul to reach Shaykh al-Islam of that time in order to get some religious credibility. Because we know that these consuls needed also some religious credibility from Shaykh al-Islam before they could start their official position. And he was advised immediately to visit Shaykh al-Islam in his house, and he did so. And he really, the idea was, we don't have troubles with the Dutch. The Dutch are, have friendly relations with us. They are in war with our, with other. So here you find that even the reception of the Dutch was also very, very positive in that sense. Within that political, the emergence of political ties, you need also formation of knowledge. And therefore, the Dutch started to be interested in consolidating the studies of Arabic and Islam. And we should mention here Leiden, where I myself have studied. But why Islamic and Arabic studies in the Netherlands? We have mentioned this political issue. I mean, just you have to understand those people. This is one. The enemy of an enemy of my enemy as a friend. Trade and economy with North Africa and the Ottoman Empire. Religion and mission, because also studying the Arabic language was also seen as a tool to understand the Bible. we have to understand something, and for example, for sure, I mean, just the East Indian Company was also an emerging something in the Orient that the Dutch wanted to understand also the regions where they were operating with their ships. But this would lead me to explain a bit the historical background of the establishment of Leiden University. Leiden University was established in that date, 1575, as a kind of token of appreciation and a gift from William of Orange, William the Silent, because the people of Leiden, this small town, they show some heroship in the resistance against the Spanish within this Catholic Protestant war. And when they kicked the Spaniards out of the city, the Prince of Orange has given them a building to establish the university, which has become the Leiden University we know. A few years later, the university started to be interested in studying Arabic or Oriental language. Therefore, they invited the famous French scholar, Scaliger, as we pronounce it in Dutch nowadays. You see him there in red. If you look very carefully, you find that he is reading in the Quran. What he has in his hand is he was writing some Arabic, reading in the Quran and studying it. This is one of the famous paintings there at the university. And when Scaliger came, he established a legacy of studying the Oriental language. What is very remarkable about him, people thought studying the Arabic language would be a tool to understand the Bible, but for him, studying Oriental languages should be based on your understanding of the philological evolutions within other communities. So his interest in Oriental language was not based solely on religious reasoning, but on sociological, philological understanding of the evolution and development of other peoples. So he established this legacy, but it was not really a separate Arabic and Islamic studies domain. With the end of the 16th century and the early 17th century, Leiden has become much more interested in Arabic language, and therefore they decided to establish the first chair of Arabic studies, which was, held by Urbanius or Van Erp. We'll come to him later because if Luther did not meet any Arab or Oriental, we see that Van Erp really met Arabs and even took lessons from Arabic-speaking people of his time. So the first chair was established in 1613, and he continued that legacy that reading Arabic is also a tool to understand the Bible. His imagination of Islam and the ideas about Islam were a mixture of some negative ideas, but also he had some appreciation to some of the Arabs and Muslims he met, and we will see this in his encounter. In his inaugural speech, for example, he made really interesting comparison between Mecca and Amsterdam. He would say Mecca was a market town in the size of Amsterdam. This was his imagination of Mecca. Muhammad was unholy and polygamous prophet. So now again you find that he knew. He even continued, this negative attitude about Islam, but in a more nuanced way. Within that framework, we know that there were a few Muslims who settled in Amsterdam of that age. Just in order to let you know, if you imagine that there were many European consuls in the Mediterranean and in the Ottoman Empire who stayed for years, in Amsterdam or in the Netherlands, you have envoys for short-term period. It was 1 month, 2 months, for religious reasons based on whether it is allowed for Muslims at these days to settle in a non-Muslim domain. But whatever the case it is, we know that there were slaves, merchants, and Dutch converts to Islam who came to the Netherlands. We have also a Catholic source which maintained that there was a dozen of Muslims who settled in Amsterdam and had their own synagogue. So we know that there was a prayer room for Muslims. And just in order to explain this, these were some of the Muslims who escaped the Inquisition in Spain with the Jews and settled in Amsterdam for a while and established a prayer hall, and later they continued their way to Istanbul. So I would like to finish with a few examples of these real encounters between the Dutch in that new Reformation context and some of those Muslim envoys and scholars who passed by Amsterdam. One of the most interesting, really interesting encounters of that time is between these two gentlemen. Jan Teunis, a Mennonite, this just like Protestant sect in the Netherlands. Those Mennonites were not allowed in the Dutch Reformation to have their own public churches, but they have what we call in Dutch schuilkerken, which means hidden churches. It could be that a building like that in, a sealed, hidden place, and you could have your own church behind the walls. So this is because they were not allowed to be be visible in public. So he was a follower of that church. And Abdelaziz ibn Muhammad al-Taghlibi. This was a Moroccan envoy who arrived in Amsterdam in 1609. You can imagine, he is in Amsterdam. This Jan Teunis studied Arabic, just like, informally. And he knew Arabic well, to the degree that in order to understand the Bible, for him the Hebrew Bible, and he had a reading group in Amsterdam to read Arabic and Hebrew. This Jan Teunis was a winemaker, printer, and he had a small lodge in Amsterdam, a small hotel. He was an eccentric guy. A traveler, an English traveler, is just like, describing him in a very funny way, that he was just like Barbarossa, this just like reddish beard and just big eccentric, has his lodge is just like, a very eccentric, odd and strange place. And you can imagine that he wanted to be a teacher in Arabic, but he couldn't get the chance. You can imagine that walking in Amsterdam, stumbling upon this Abdelaziz. And he said, when I saw this Abdelaziz in his Oriental attire, I started talking to him, Assalamu alaikum, kayfa haluk? Can you imagine in 1609 that an Arab Moroccan walking on the streets of Amsterdam now, what we know Central Station Amsterdam, meeting this eccentric guy, talking Arabic to him? What are you doing here? ماذا تفعل هنا? He's mentioning this in some of the documents. And then he would invite him to come in and to stay in his lodge, in his hotel for free, on the condition that he should teach him Arabic. He stayed there for 6 months, and Jan Teunis wrote about this in details in Arabic and Latin, and the manuscript is still existent in the Municipality Archive of Leiden. And you find him talking about all the debates he had about Jesus and Muhammad. They respected each other, but they had different views of religion. For 6 months, Abdelaziz would stay there and teaching him Arabic from a copy of the Quran, which is still in the University of Amsterdam, in the library. And then he left this copy for him as a kind of, memorial about him. So you find now a kind of friendship. Even Jan Teunis is mentioning that he has become one of his best friends, and Abdelaziz left for Mecca for Hajj, and we lost any trace of his. This is one of the first real encounters between the Dutch and the Arab speaking. The next one is a remarkable one, and this is the longest and most detailed piece written by a Moriscus Moroccan in Arabic about his experience in Dutch. So we know much from the Dutch side. It's much documented, better documented. But from the Arab side, we have this, travelogue by this Arab gentleman, or just Moriscus Moroccan, you can say. He is Ahmed ibn Qasim al-Hajari, who died after 1640. And he came to Amsterdam approximately in 1612. When he came there, he met, we have just mentioned the name of the professor of Arabic, Jan Teunis, and they met for the first time in Paris, and then later they met in Leiden. Ahmad ibn Qasim al-Hajari wrote a book which is in Arabic, Nasiruddin ala al-Qawm al-Kafirin, the victorious of religion upon the unbelieving people, in which he documented his travel from Paris to Belgium to the Netherlands. And here I have just made some quotations from that into Arabic, in which he explicitly, he called it just like, Falantas. This was the Flemish, Dutch speaking part. We will go there because they do not harm Muslims, but they are very kind to them. نذهب إلى فلنطس لأنهم لا يضرون المسلمين بل يحسنون إليهم. It's very clear that the Dutch are nicer to Muslims than in any other Western European part. ولما بلغنا إلى مدينة أمستردام, and when we arrived in the city of Amsterdam, رأيت العجب في حسن بنيانها. I saw the marvel of its beautiful buildings, and then it was just very crowded, and it was like Paris. Just imagination of Amsterdam is like Paris, and many ships. ولم تكن في الدنيا مدينة بكثرة السفن مثلها. Many ships and boats on that city. They say that it's about around 6,000 ships. So I was impressed by that. And then again, he would specifically and clearly talk about Martin Luther and Calvin, and that they are good people, good guys for him. And then Wa'alam, and they have just like islands, and they were just belonging to Sultan al-Andalus, the Catholic king. And then there was, you have Luther and Calvin, who came in order to change the religion of the Christians from the corruption that has been brought up, in order just like to correct it and to reform it and to put it on the right way. And وأن البابا بروما يضلون الناس بعبادة الأصنام. And then the Pope in Rome, they are just misleading the people to worship statues. And then he just revolted against that, and the people of Falantas, or the Dutch people, were just like against that. When he came to the Netherlands, he met again his old friend Van Erp, the Dutch scholar of Arabic and Islamic studies, and they debated about many issues. Even he received some lessons for him, just like, and people were impressed by his Arabic and reading of Arabic. And Van Erp is writing about him very interestingly in Dutch, here a translation of it, a civilized and intelligent man. This is his impression about Ahmad ibn Qasim al-Hajari, who as youth studied literature and who even speaks moderately. And look at this is very interesting, good Latin Arabic. This is a standard Arabic. This is how he saw that. So this is also a very remarkable relationship between a Muslim Moroccan and this Dutch scholar of Arabic studies of that time. Besides that, you have also the question of conversion, because you have Dutch people who converted to Islam, and we have also traces of some Muslims who converted to Christianity in the Netherlands. And then I mentioned just like 2 or 3 examples of that. You have a 39 years old Henry Sharif, who claimed to be the son of one of the sultans in North Africa or Morocco, and he became even a soldier in the cavalry of Prince Frederick of Nassau. This is also from the family of the parents of Orange, and he married to a certain Traintje from Sluis, who lived in Leiden at this time, and he converted to Christianity. So we have just like 2 or 3 examples. We know them from Muslims, Arab Muslims, who arrived in the Netherlands and converted to Christianity. The other way around, with much more common, or at least that we know, we have much more historical details about that. But those who turned Turks were also risking their life, because there were some regulations, even it reached some to the degree of death penalty of those who turned Turks and went away. If they returned back, they would liable to have this death penalty. And they were portrayed in the media of that time as corrupt, immoral, bloodthirsty, opportunist, and so forth and so forth. But we have a very remarkable example of young who took the name Murad Reyes, and he became known in John Barber in English. But this Murad Reyes reached a very high military rank in North Africa, in Morocco, and he was really famous in that time, and he could, but we have to understand also with the treaties with Morocco and the Ottoman Empire, you had on the one hand those who turned Turks are endangered, but on the other hand they are protected because they are on these ships which are protected by the agreements between the Ottomans and the Dutch. So it has become very controversial and inconsistent for the Dutch policy, because they could not follow them or prosecute those who turn Turks, because when they show up on the Dutch harbor, they show up on Ottoman protected ships. And Jans knew that, so arrived the harbor of Enkhuizen in the Netherlands, and he could see his children and wife on the ship, and the Dutch were just like, looking at him on his ship, because they could not, persecute him, because he was at the end protected under this, Moroccan Dutch ties. I think I will end up here to come with just like very general conclusions, which indicates that on the one hand, you see that Islam was portrayed in the theological and religious atmosphere as as a very dominant, just a very devilish religion. Muhammad is corrupt, he's the Antichrist, but on the other hand, Muslims and Islam was used as a political tool in this conflict with the Catholic world. And I think this would reflect, if we think about these examples, maybe the name of Ibn Qasim al-Hajari or Abdul Aziz, they may not sound Dutch as we imagine nowadays, but I think their stories tell us about the Dutch history in this early modern time. So here, this interconnected ties with the Dutch history, the entanglement of Dutch histories, these Arab and Muslim names who appear really in Dutch history could just like, make us reflect about the emergence of Islam and Muslims in this time of Reformation and the Catholic Protestant conflicts. And I think on the one hand we find gruesome negative attitudes towards Islam, but on the other hand we find that the Dutch bourgeoisie were promoting a kind of pragmatic vision about Islam in that critical period of the emergence of the Dutch Republic. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Omar and Professor David Grafton. So now it's time for questions and answers. But yes, Nick, you have an announcement? In a minute, please. I want to tell you that we have available a pamphlet that shows you how you can access this special issue about Islam and the Protestant Reformation online, thanks to publisher. It will not be forever available online, but then you can indeed have the whole issue and not just the articles or presentations of two of the scholars who are behind that special issue. So no questions. Please make your questions short. No comments, no statements, no emotional questions. Let's remain purely academic, and I will ask similarly from the speakers to provide short answers so that we have more opportunities for the questions. So, Nick.
This is for Dr. Grafton. So David.
Wait for the micro, please.
So everybody can hear you.
Certainly. Dr. Grafton, so two quick questions. One, there is a quote that goes around attributed to Martin Luther that says that it's better to be ruled by a wise Turk than a foolish Christian. And I'm curious, considering that Martin Luther never met a Turk, Muslim, etc. Is this just folklore, or is there context to this quote? And then the second is, within the issue that we have on the social-political aspects of the Turks, one of the articles within the special issue talks about letters from the Sultan recognizing Protestants as a Christian sect. Is this the earliest non-Protestant recognition of Protestantism that we have? Meaning that, is there anything else historically that we can say recognizes Protestantism other than these letters from the Sultan Murad IV?
Yes, and yes. No, so, that's short, right. No, so, yes, there are numerous occasions in Luther's table talks, which were compilations by Luther's students that were written down during their table conversations in their home. And in numerous occasions, there were comments about the Sultan, about Suleiman. And in one occasion, somebody said, do you know that word has reached the Suleiman about you? And Luther says, well, I think he would find me a good subject, right, to be under him. So there's definitely other references to Luther talking about the Turks and from that perspective. So yeah, that's in the table talks. The second one, from a foreign powers perspective, recognizing the legitimacy of Protestant or non-Catholic territories, outside of the Catholics themselves, yes. But certainly within Europe, there was, before that, the Catholic Holy Roman Emperor himself had to legitimize Protestant states and their ability to maintain their Protestantism. But outside of Europe, yeah, I mean, that would have, to my knowledge.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes, sir.
You don't have to bring the microphone. I was curious how it plays out today. I know it's not relevant to the talk, but has history evolved where the Netherlands are different? You know, coming from a Mennonite background, and you're still interested in other cultures just as much as they were then. How is that playing out today? Is it different in Holland than in other countries? Are the Dutch, as they were then, more tolerant?
Oh, yeah. It's a very good question. I think this idea of Calvinist attitude to others is still present in the Dutch, culture and imagination nowadays. The question of liever Turks than Paps, the statement was it's still mentioned in the folks' mouth. People are repeating it. Sometimes you don't know where does it come from, but they're still talking about it because just when they are speaking about their Protestant identity, and against the Catholics, still the word Paps is used in Dutch in a very, inferior way. When you are talking about the Catholics, they are the Paps, and liever Turks than Paps. Just like, so you see that. Whether this is reflected in the tolerance of the Dutch nowadays, I don't know, but just like I think in cities like Amsterdam, which is a multicultural city by nature, you would find the attitude towards Muslims and others different from people in the village and the countryside. But I believe that Calvinist spirit is still dominating in how the Dutch approach the other nowadays, away from the fact that, right extremist parties or extreme right parties now active there, but I think it's there. The Calvinist spirit is definitely there.
Thank you. Yes, Majid.
Thank you very much. It's an outsider question. I'm not
I'm not doing any research on that period of Christian-Muslim relations. But I know from my research in the early Islam, Christian-Muslim relations interlocution, when they meet, we have extant in our hands some Kalam texts, some texts about, theological questions and answers and all that. Do we happen to have extant today some of the possible written texts on these interactions between Christians and Muslims in Netherlands when they met? Did they leave behind them any, documentation of conversation they had on theology? Because you alluded to some conversations. So do we have manuscripts on that?
Yeah. Actually, if I look at the Arabic sources, especially regarding this early period of Reformation, it's a pity that you don't have really, if you look what you have explained, David, we have lots of materials from the Christian part, writing about Islam and Muslims, but how Muslims received the question of Reformation in Arabic sources, I myself failed to find any, full detailed corpus of that. But within this Dutch context, you have these polemical and theological issues. They are mentioned either in Nasr al-Din ala al-Qawm al-Kafirin. This Ahmad ibn Qasim al-Hajari, he wrote extensively about that. He even mentioned that he had a religious polemical debate. I didn't have time to dwell on that in my presentation. Even in the court of the Prince of Orange, the follower of William, and with Maurits, in Prince Maurits' palace, he had really questions about these debates. Even Maurits Maurice asked him about the Prophet Muhammad, but he very politely apologized that he couldn't answer these questions, but he promised to write about that. And we know that when he returned back to Morocco, he wrote a treatise in Arabic and replied to the prince, but we don't have it. That he replied to the prince about these questions, and it was received in the Dutch court, but unfortunately we have only traces from some people who attended this, who translated to the prince the content of that. But in the court, he was able to meet some Jewish and Christian Dutch people, and he mentioned in that Nasr al-Din al-Qawm al-Kafirin that he debated with them the question of Trinity, the question of the prophethood of Muhammad, etc., etc. So we have some of these traces, but not in much detail. With the other example I have mentioned, Abdul Aziz and Jan Turnus, we have the document of Jan Turnus. What is really interesting about Jan Turnus, that he wrote that when Abdul Aziz left. And he wrote it this way, very, really interesting, in Latin and Arabic. So you find that he wrote first, his Arabic is very good, but it's sometimes cosmetic, because he was writing in Latin and translating into Arabic. When you read the Arabic, it's funny, but it's very interesting to study it from a philological perspective, how Arabic was taught and understood by those Arabists of that time. And he mentioned some of these debates with Abdul Aziz, that they discussed also the prophethood of Muhammad and Trinity and etc., etc. But it remains on the surface of these, polemical theological discussions, not really deeper, as you mentioned it in the Kalam, complexity as we understand it.
Can I make a comment on the earlier period? Najib, this may not be exactly to your question, but it's similar in that for Luther, he had access to George of Hungary's diary about his time as a slave, 20 years as a slave under the Ottomans. And that's where he got most of his material about what the Turks did, their religious life, their family life. And Luther found this to be the most important and fair reading of Islam that he found. But it wasn't theology, it wasn't kalam, it was just on popular piety, right, and practice. It's later that he looks at the previous medieval Dominican works from the 12th century that had read Arabic material or translated Arabic material into Latin that was polemical. And it's that material that's 400 years older that he goes back to when he starts thinking about the theology of Islam versus Christianity. So for me, that's kind of interesting, that you would go out back to a source 400 years old. That was all they had for him at that time. By the time you get to Leiden, it's much different. So that resonates today. I mean, you can still find some of these items online. You can still go online and people keep reusing and recycling these theological tracts. So.
Thank you. So, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you all for your presentations. Dr. Grafton, 2 quick questions. You mentioned the preoccupation Rome had with the Turks that allowed the Reformation to flourish. Is there any parallel in terms of historical accident of the preoccupation of Byzantium with its own corruptions that allowed Islam to explode out of Arabia?
Well, the general current views about the 7th century are that the eastern regions of the Byzantine Empire were in a state of decay by 630, 640, and also had suffered severe setbacks from the Persians, who had captured Jerusalem and most of the Byzantine outposts shortly before Muhammad came onto the scene as a power in Arabia. But in terms of the religious, are you asking about religious corruptive practices?
I'm thinking about your reference to what if, okay?
Yeah.
And so the fact that you had a Roman preoccupation with the Reformation, with the Turks, that allowed the Reformation to flourish. I'm talking about the Byzantine preoccupation with its own survival that allowed politically, militarily, as well as religiously, an easier path for Islam to expand.
Yeah, I don't know. I think the loss of those districts in the Middle East, the Arabic districts, if you will, in the Middle East, was devastating for the Byzantines. And so maybe they would have looked for excuses to blame it on somebody. And some of the I can't recall who wrote it, but some of the works that I've read talk about the economic issues with landed nobles, Byzantine landed nobles in Syria at the time, and their kind of exploitation of the land. So they probably wanted to blame it on that, but I don't know if you can go so far as to make the parallel. At least I wouldn't.
Parallels are always fraught. The other question with Luther, the thing that strikes me about the birth of Reformation was the absolute hostility of Rome and the cardinals to allowing Luther to ask any questions whatsoever. And in my reading of him, I see him being very patient with that for a while, and that his acerbic or potty language you talk about really is birthed in reaction many times to exhausted patience. I wonder what your opinion of that is.
Yeah, so he had a very active tongue, right? So, and that was early on directed not at the Pope. It was directed at Tetzel and some other people for what he saw were practices taking advantage of Germans and German Christians. So he first and foremost really directed a lot of his accusations at lower officials, and certainly Albrecht of Mainz, who was the archbishop over the German-speaking territory. It's then after the papal bull, when Luther is threatened with excommunication, that he realizes that the institution's not going to change, and that's when he really. It's after the burning of the papal bull of his excommunication that I suppose he figured, why do I have to bother worrying about what I say, because I'm a heretic anyway. So.